chapter 7. As far as we know, Jesus didn't write anything during his ministry. And I love I love that I added, as far as we know. Most of the time in scholarship, they don't say that. Jesus didn't write anything. And we know that he didn't. Well, no, we don't. The Gospels are not full-blown stenographic historical records of Jesus. Well, there's all kinds of stuff. What was his favorite food? What did Jesus' laugh sound like? There's an enormous amount of stuff of the real Jesus. We just don't know. Yeah. So as far as we know, he didn't write anything. The Gospels never tell us he wrote anything so we don't know. So the Gospels are written about Jesus, not by him, by various authors. And secondly, let me say is we don't know who wrote the Gospels. If you look in let's bring up our Gospels now in your New Testament. We'll go there often. The Gospels in your New Testament. Let's just start with, just for fun, we'll just start with Matthew because we'll get there faster. If you look at the very beginning of Matthew chapter 1, you just go not the intro, but the chapter itself, right at the beginning of the whole gospel. We don't know who wrote them. Look at Matthew 1:1. Does yours at the top say the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah? Or does it say according to Matthew? Maybe something like that, according to Matthew, in your intro? Or what about the intro way before the intro of the book itself? What does it say, though? The Gospel according to Matthew? Something like that? Some of your apps don't have much on there. That expression, the Gospel according to Matthew, is not in the most primitive manuscripts. It shows up. Now, of course, part of the problem is the primitive ones, the earliest manuscripts, are fragmentary. They might have been there from the very beginning, but we don't have evidence of that. The first reference at all in the history of which we have, there's a lot of things we don't have because manuscripts were destroyed or burned or lost or worn out. So it's somewhat of an argument from silence to say it wasn't there. But based on what we have, the first time anybody references the titles of the Gospels is Irenaeus. And that's around 170 or so AD. That's the first time. So when other early church documents talk about the Gospels, they don't say, this comes from the Gospel of Luke. This comes from the Gospel of John. They just quote it. So the actual names of the Gospels is somewhat debated, it's not somewhat, it is debated among New Testament scholars when they got their names.
So they didn't care about plagiarism?
They did not care about plagiarism, she said. They did not. Not at all. Not whatsoever. For a lot of reasons, especially when it came to sacred text, they respected it so much they wanted to use it. And word for word, the better, or even close, so they didn't have a problem with that at all. So all I'm saying is the Gospels don't have names until quite some time later. Now, most New Testament scholars, and there's a lot of reasons here, and if you want me to slow down on this, I can, or move ahead, but most New Testament scholars do think they received names very early on. Why? Because the Gospels would have been copied and passed to local churches very early on. So then I ask the question, hey, give me that Gospel. Which one? Is it Gospel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Which one is it? So early, probably, I think, and many do, by the late of the first century, within the first few decades of when they're written, they've already got names attached to them. And many think they were first attached as kind of like a toe tag. When books were written in the ancient world, they weren't codexes. Remember the book? The earliest form were scrolls. And the way you wrap up a scroll, I'm showing you with my hands here, where you both sides, if it's a real big one, it has two sides, you pull it out like a handlebar. If it's one, the smaller ones have one scroll. You roll all the way up, you put a seal on it. Well, the smaller ones or the two, they could put caps on the end if they wanted. They're wealthier. They put it on the end of this thing like a cubicle. And you see the side of my house here? Imagine that we're divided in a bunch of small squares. You think about that. They don't stand up like a book. So what do you do with a scroll? You have little cubicles and you shove them by section and probably by subject matter. Like a teacher mailbox. Or at church we have mail slots. Mm-hmm. Ours are wider, like a rectangle, but they've probably been like that or maybe more like a square shape. I'm not exactly sure. The libraries of Ephesus and Alexandria were burned and destroyed, which is horrible. But the stuff we lost through time. But at the end of it, they would take a piece of papyrus or a piece of string and they would wrap around it a little ID tag, and it would dangle from the scroll. That's how you could look to imagine a wall full of those scrolls. How do you know where to look? Well, you could flip through those ID tags. And there have been scholars who suggested that's where the first names were added. And so it'd say katar Matthean, which means according to Matthew in Greek. And so it's the gospel according to Matthew, a gospel according to Mark, gospel according to Luke. And it became early on attached. We don't know exactly why. I think that's how it happened. And I think it happened very early on. But some people like Bart Ehrman think it didn't happen until the end of the 2nd century. I just don't find that compelling at all. So that means that each gospel represents the style of the authors and the needs of the communities in which they were written. That is, they did not interview Jesus with a recorder. They deliberately wrote a story about Jesus, about him. Now let's be real clear, just to make sure we're on the same page. The Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I think I might say this later on. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very, very similar to each other. So if Chelsea reads Matthew, then she reads Mark after, you go, boy, I thought I read all that. Well, you will have read big portions. Over 93% of Mark is used in Matthew and 80-something in Luke. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, they're so similar together, they made up a word for that, to be seen together, synoptic. Synoptic gospel means to be seen together, seen beside each other. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are real similar. John's the odd bird. John's that sibling that's a little weird that you wonder if they're really adopted. That's John. And scholars go back and forth for centuries whether or not they think John, the author, whomever that was, knew of the Synoptic Gospels, or even one of them, and deliberately wrote something different, or didn't know it at all and just came up with a different gospel. But those are the big four. Does that make sense? Any question about that at all? Anything at all? Random questions. Good. That's a great question. So why in the order in which they're at? Yeah, that's right. They're not in chronological order. They're not. Some of the collections, depending on where it is, are by the longest to the shortest. For example, the prophets. They're the major prophets and minor prophets. The Gospels themselves are probably in the order in which they are because eventually in the early church, Matthew was let me say this differently. Matthew in the primitive church, early church, seems to have been the favorite gospel. Matthew was. The manuscripts who have different gospels have the gospels in different orders, but by the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, Matthew won the day at being the first one. And that's probably just because it was one of the most popular ones in the early church. It also could be the case because the genealogy starts and seems to pick off real well and kind of Jewish, you might say. So it depends. When you read the letters of Paul, there are 13 letters of Paul, and they go to some degree from longest to shortest. So Romans, then you get Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and so forth. So there's no deep, profound connection between all of them, if that's the order you're talking about. And they're not in chronological order. It's hard to date several of the documents. We don't know exactly when they're written. There's something called the Chronological Study Bible that tries to place all of it in chronological order. My first question is, well, how do you know that? There's tons of books, not tons, but of 66 Old New Testament together.
That would have been my next question. Do you know the dates? 'Cause I know
We
there's
just don't.
Like a law, BC or whatever.
Yes. Some we can,
I haven't read all the way through.
that's good.
So I was curious.
So how do we know the dates? Yeah, the dates, that's a good question. No, it is. Some dates we can set, some books we can date pretty certain because the characters represented in the stories have been corroborated outside of the Bible. And when you put those characters with other characters that we have in, say, it's called cuneiform, Egyptian clay tablets, we have over 1 million of those. You have the literature and inscriptions and coins, and you compare it and all these things together, we start putting, that happened when King so-and-so lost that battle. Over here we learn that king did this in this year. That was the year of the Great Flood, or that was the year of the comet. Well, we can know when comets nowadays, when Halley's Comet came the last 3,000 years, because it comes on the same routine. So if it lists something like that comet, well, we can set it the exact day, because you can just go on Google, when was Halley's Comet in the year 2000 BC? It'll tell you right, where it was in the galaxy or whatever. So there's a lot of ways to date it. That's when we can date it. Otherwise, we can't. There's sometimes we can't. Case in point is Luke's gospel. It says, and I'll do this in Luke, when I preach on Luke chapter 2, it says when Herod the Great, X, Y, Z on. Well, we know Herod the Great from other sources died around 4 BC, from 6 to 4 BC. So if that's accurate, it means Jesus was born before he died, because he's in the story. But it's a story about his birth. Well, think about that. That means Jesus was born around 4 to 6 BC.
Does it?
Which means the time as we know it is wrong. Yes. That's right. That's right, because time is wrong. They get pretty close. Yeah, Dionysius Exiguus II was a monk who was asked by the emperor to come up with a regular universal standardized calendar around 525 or so. And he did, and he's just wrong. He was close, he was just wrong. But nevertheless, once that's set into the Roman Empire, once that's set by the Roman Catholic Church, it was set. And to this day, that's why it's called BC and AD. It's just that Jesus was not born in the year 1 AD. He just was almost certainly. Good question.
Solid answer.
Why do we read the Gospels? Why did they write them in the first place? We do not know. We don't know. I mean, the Gospels don't say, here's exactly what was going on in my life. The closest we get is John chapter 20, when he says, there are many other signs and wonders I could record, but I wrote this so that, depending on how you translate this Greek word in the manuscripts, so that you might believe or that you might continue to believe. That's the closest we get, but that's in John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke never tell us why he writes. So what scholars have done through the time is we give educated guesses. And I think these are really good educated guesses. And since this is not a master level class on Gospels, I'm not going to tell you all the reasons why. But these two big reasons probably are, I think, to me, they're quite compelling. Probably two main reasons why they wrote the Gospels in the first place. One is historical. They wanted information about Jesus' ministry to demonstrate continuity between the earthly Jesus and the Jesus they worship and pray to as ruling resurrected Lord. I need this to sink in as much as possible. Make sure you get your chronology. Speaking of chronology, Paul's letters were written first, then the Gospels. Don't let your order confuse you there. Paul's letters come first, then the Gospels. If you'll notice on Sundays during the service, during communion, I put up scripture verses. And the scriptures I put up, I'm here for notice, they're not from the Gospels. It's from 1 Corinthians. I did it on purpose because that's the most primitive story of the Lord's Supper there exists. It's before the Gospels. And I like primitive. It's the most ancient form. The early Christians are all Jews and then early Gentiles, and they start preaching about Jesus. People get converted. They get all happy. They receive the Spirit, start singing songs, a cappella, and with some probably musicians. I'm sorry, Church of Christ. There's no reason at all to think they didn't pull out the lyre and some other instruments. I don't find that compelling that they had no instruments at all. But they sang, they worshiped, they wrote songs to Jesus. They experienced his presence way before the Gospels were written. For decades this happened. Decades. Jesus died almost certainly around April 7th, AD 30. AD 30, it's on a Friday. So, and by the time the first Gospel was written, we're not sure when, but I can tell you later on if you want. Mark's Gospel was probably written first, and I think it was written, and many scholars, but not all, think it was written probably in the early to mid 60s. So let's say that's true, which you don't know for sure. That's 30 years of no Gospels. That's 30 years of stories about Jesus just being told and told from church to church to church. And let that sink in. How old are you? It's for 30 years of your life. Some of you aren't even old, right? You haven't been born yet.
My entire life.
That's your entire life. There's no book they read from like we can do right now. They only hear about it from reading the Old Testament and then saying, see, this text speaks about Jesus. See, this text speaks about Jesus. They read Isaiah 51, 52, 53, Psalm 22, Psalm 51. They go, this talks about Jesus. Then you have a prophet stand up and say, I've got a word from the Lord today. Then you have someone else sing a song. Then you have a prophet or prophetess say, I got a word from the Lord again. Let me hear this one. Then someone starts praying in tongues for 30 years. And then the Gospels get written down. Now, so the odds are pretty high that they were written down because the first generation started to die off. And not everyone who was in the early church knew about the historical Jesus or, the Jesus that existed that well. And so they wanted to write down stories of his life. And that's probably one of the major reasons why. 2, pastoral reasons. Within a few decades of Jesus' resurrection, most Christians were Greek-speaking Gentiles and not Palestinian Aramaic-speaking Jews. Let this sink in. I'm going to give you another analogy in a second. The Christian communities needed Gospels written in a language they could understand when they heard it, Greek, as well as emphasizing teachings and events of Jesus that ministered to their particular needs. The Gospels are originally written in Greek. There are some Aramaic expressions like Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, and Hebrew, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And you have some Talitha Kum, which means the Lord God say rise. You have Aramaic phrases. You've got some Latin isms. You've got some Aramaisms. That is when Aramaic, someone who doesn't know the language, but they kind of use it as a borrowed term. You have some things like that. But 99% of the Gospels, 99.5 is Greek. Well, the deal is Jesus never spoke Greek as far as we know. He probably knew some. He probably did know some. But almost certainly it was not his dominant language. His dominant language was Aramaic. So every time you read an English translation, you are already 2 languages removed from Jesus. No Gospels are written in Aramaic. They're only in Greek. And imagine for a second that we start a religion and we're following the prophetess Deborah. And we're here for 23 years, and word spreads all through Kansas. Then it spreads and spreads and gets all the way down to Mexico. And there's some Mexican immigrants here, but they speak Spanish. 30 years have gone by. They're not from Kansas. What do you tell them? What do you tell them about the original founder, about what really happened? What analogies do you use? What metaphors do you use? What if they've never been around a cornfield? What if they don't know what a Jayhawk is? Like, nobody in the world knows what it is. So how would you explain it? And that's what the Gospels are. They're a couple decades removed from the actual facts, written in a different language, because people could not understand Aramaic. Obviously, they would have written in Aramaic. They wrote in Greek. So it's Greek-speaking Gentiles, like my Mexican analogy. Now, some were Jews, no doubt, but the predominant part of the population was Gentile. Now, having said that real quickly, let me say, this is, again, everything's debated in New Testament scholarship, but I find it compelling, and I could tell you why if you want, that the Gospels do primarily come from eyewitness testimony as the background. I'm convinced that, and many people are, the Gospels are written within the lifetime of eyewitness testimony. So they would have consulted the people who saw it, or the children or siblings of the people who saw it. And maybe if you want, later on I'll give you some examples of that that I think make that very compelling. And anyway, so there we go. So I think the Gospel is written to help explain to these Greek-speaking Gentiles what this Aramaic, Jewish, Galilean guy talked about. And now they could read a document. The original Wycliffe Association. If that makes any sense to you. Okay, any questions about that? Matthew 27:33. Let's look at that real quickly. We won't look at all these, but it's fun. Matthew 27:33. I didn't bring my Greek home. It's one of those things your mind goes, bring that home. I go, no, I don't need that. And then I should have done it. Matthew 27:33 is when they say, remember, this is I'll start in verse 32, that's fine. As they went out, they came upon a man from Cyrene named Shimeon or Simon. They compelled this man to carry his cross. That's Jesus' cross. When they came to a place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink, mixed with blah, blah, blah. Does your translation put that in parentheses or comma, which means place of a skull? Chelsea, do you see that? Yeah, for there? In Greek, there's no such thing as parentheses. So in Greek, this is all letter by letter by letter by letter right beside each other. And it would have said Golgotha, which means place of a skull. Now, why would Matthew need to translate the word Golgotha, which is Aramaic and in Hebrew too? Why would he need to translate this term into a Greek, which means, or translated, place of a skull? Why do that?
Is it one of those words you're talking about?
Yes. It's one of those words. Now, why is it? Because to whom is he writing? What's the assumption? He's writing to an audience that would not have known what? They don't know what Golgotha means. They don't know what that language is. And so we have these telltale signs that he's having to translate it for his audience. Go back to the gospel. Well, back. It's after. I was thinking chronologically. Mark chapter 5. Mark 5:41. Here's an example. Mark 5:41. These are the telltale signs that scholars use to go, oh, you know what? I bet this is what's going on. And Mark 5:41. Jesus takes a little girl by the hand. I just quoted it a second ago. I didn't realize I was going to read that. He took her by the hand and said, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, get up. Again, why the need to translate it for us? And it's because the audience could not understand what Aramaic is. They don't know it. The audience is not there. 15:34, that's Ela Ela lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? John 20:16, and on and on. So you see those examples? Go to Mark chapter 7, just a little bit later, Mark 7. There are times in the Gospels where the the author has to not only translate the words, but tell us what was going on back in the context. Mark 7, 1-4. Mark 7, 1-4. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. Now why the need to explain to me what defiled hands mean? Most scholars would say, and I would say, that's a telltale sign that defiled hands or unclean hand was technical words for the Pharisees to mean hands that are ritually impure. You've not washed them appropriately. But he uses almost, I think what's going on is Mark is using the standard term they used, but the Greek audience removed from a different town doesn't know what defiled hands means, so he has to say, that is without washing them. He's helping us audience understand what that means. And look in verse 3. Does you have in parentheses there? Yeah. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders, and they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it, and they're also blah, 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 blah. Why does he need to explain that unless he's speaking to an audience that is not from Galilee, and they're not Aramaic-speaking Jews from Galilee? Go to Mark chapter 13, 14. These are the telltale signs that when you read carefully, you notice for yourself. Mark 13, 14 is really incredible. Mark 13 is a long passage that's very complicated and debated about what he means by all this stuff. He says, but when you see the desolating sacrilege, this is Jesus talking about the destruction of the temple, when it's set up where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. Is that in parentheses there? Let the reader understand? Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. What in the world? See, almost certainly the author of Mark, which I think really was John Mark, I don't think Jesus said, let the reader understand. No scholar thinks that. I think Mark says, let the reader understand. That's why they put it in parentheses. But in Greek, there's no parentheses. It would have said, ought not to be, let the reader understand, and those in Judea. It seems to me the best compelling answer is that Mark did that, again, for his, not just audience, but whom exactly? Who he tells you? The reader of the gospel.
So that was for us.
Well, not now, kind of. It was for
For
us.
anybody that read the gospel.
It was for anybody, but in the first century context, since most people were illiterate, some people get all the way up to maybe 10% who could read formally. That's not what happened. In a gospel setting, in a church like us, let's say I'm the only one who's trained to read, I would be the reader. And so when I got a letter from the church in Austin, Texas, I'm the designated reader. And I read the text. And that's what happened in the ancient world. Only one or two people in a church, at best, if they didn't have to borrow a friend down the road or a neighbor, can you come read this to us? And so the Mark is writing to the reader. He knows this will be read aloud. So people often say, well, I don't read the Bible well, but I like to listen to it. And they kind of feel ashamed. I said, don't. You're doing better than the rest of us. It was intended to be read aloud. It's been intended to heard. It actually is. In Greek, we miss it some now, but in Greek, some things are alliterations. They repeat the same sound several times from memory. Like in the Beatitudes, the first 5 blessed are all P. They're all, but they don't translate well like that. So when you hear it, it stands out. So here the reader, let the reader understand. What does it mean, let understand it? Probably it means that the reader would then help interpret. They would read it and then help explain the text after they read it. And the understand means understand what they're talking about. The desolating sacrilege is a throwback to Daniel 7. And that's a long story. But anyway, it's a throwback Old Testament text. And so I think he's encouraging the reader to say, make sure you know your Bible. Make sure you know your Bible. So these are those kind of telltale signs that show up in the Gospels that let us know that the original audience is not in the room. This was written for people in a different time period, in a different language. Any questions or comments about that? Oh, I tell you in the footnote, I forgot to mean the note here in 37. Anagnosis, a professional reader. Anagnostis, that's it, anagnostis. The G is silent, anagnostis. Why do we think the Gospels have the names they do? Well, there's different reasons why. Well, one of the reasons we think Mark was written by a guy named Mark, John Mark, Ioannis Marcus was been his name in Hebrew and Latin. Ioannis Marcus was not a disciple, not an apostle of Jesus. He wasn't. He shows up in Acts. He's cousin with Barnabas, and Barnabas' family was pretty wealthy because they had to sell land and give to people. And which means if he's a wealthy Jew, he would have received a formal education in Jerusalem. Formal education means he would have learned how to read Greek to some degree and probably write it. So he's not the average Joe, at least from Acts. Later on, and I'll stay with me, this is a little convoluted, the early Christians kept writing documents outside the New Testament. They kept writing documents and letters and gospels and whatever. They're not all trustworthy to what really happened, but the church liked to think about, what did Jesus do when he was a kid? What did he do? What about this? What about? And they made up stories. And they was circulated around, and they wrote other apocalypses besides Revelation. Apocalypse of Peter, Shepherd of Hermas, all these things show up. They're real popular in the early church. And we have church leaders who wrote documents about theology. And we don't have almost any of them. It's a shame. There's a guy named Eusebius. He has a long name, but we call him Eusebius for short. He writes in the early 300s, early 4th century, let's say 325. He wrote several documents. One of the multi-volume work he wrote was called, it's translated from Latin, Church History. And in that document, he talks about a whole bunch of early church fathers and Christians and leaders for whom we have no other evidence. None. We have no other. If he didn't tell us about them, we didn't know they existed. And we don't always know how much he's telling as a legend. We just don't always know. But he tells about a guy named Papias, or Papias if you're British. Papias was the bishop of Hierapolis, which is in Asia Minor. If you know where Turkey is, Turkiye, as they say. Asia Minor is in Turkey. He was there near Bithynia, which is a small Roman place on the, if you know where the boot is, it's on the east side of the boot. Your church map, your Bible might have a map back there. But anyway, he is from there, and Eusebius tells about Papias. Now, what's so important is, Eusebius, who writes around 325, talks about Papias, who lived around the early 100s. And he talks about this multi-volume work that Papias wrote, for which we have zero evidence. We lost it, except for some quotes that Eusebius gives. Now, we just have to trust Eusebius wasn't mistaken or lying, but apparently he has access to the copies that we no longer have. And oh, Lord, I wish we had them. Because Papias talks about is some of the earliest history of the church. Now, if you're really skeptical about these things, you dismiss it all out of, you just say it's nonsense, all legend. And for a lot of German scholars and some American, maybe Bart Ehrman and others think it's nonsense. But the last few decades, British and American scholars have said, wait a second, let's don't dismiss it too quickly. What if it's legit? What if it was real? Well, what's interesting is Papias says, so Eusebius says that Papias says, that there are 4 Gospels. Now, he gets Matthew wrong, probably. He said it was originally written in Hebrew. Probably was not. But he says Peter is the background. Basically, he says John Mark was the Greek word can be interpreter or translator of Peter. That John Mark was the interpreter of Peter. And that's where that tradition comes from. Now, what's interesting is he says that, and then later on the tradition rises that this gospel is called the Gospel according to Mark. What makes it very likely is there seems to be no reason to lie about that, especially because Mark is not a major apostle. He would not have been a major leader in the Christian church. It's different if it said the Gospel of Peter. They had that too. That was fake. But if it was the Gospel of Peter, oh, come on now. You want to make it like it's really important. But Mark is not a major player. So it's weird to give his name to us, the Gospel. And it's the shortest Gospel. And it seemed to be used the least. And so it's interesting that the church kept on to it because they already had Matthew and Luke and they had most of Mark. Why even keep it? Almost certainly it's because it was associated with Peter, who was a big dog in the church. And so you have a lot of Mark's gospel. If you read it from the perspective of Peter, it's amazing. Peter shows up the most in a name and character more than any other disciple in the gospel. If you assume it is Petrine, that's from Peter, he's from Galilee and a fisherman. The locales are almost entirely on the northeast side of Galilee or back and forth, which is where he fished. The little boy who gives the fish and loaves of bread, he gives a little fish. That particular word used is almost certainly the same word used today. There are Galilean sardines that are still sold in that part of the lake. And so no, they all do, but they all get different details of what happened. Yeah, like John says it's green grass and Luke says something else. But if you assume Peter's behind it, it does make a lot of sense of Mark. And Matthew's a different story, Luke's a different story. But I'm saying I'm giving you a quick Cliff's notes of why is it probably called Gospel of Mark? Probably because it really was written by him, but most of the material probably comes from Peter. And Papias, by the way, Papias also said, that bishop, the guy who said that stuff, he also said he translated Peter and took down what he said, but he did not put it in chronological order. He said he did not put it in order. And it's probably Papias' way of explaining why Mark's gospel is not in chronological order. And the sayings are kind of all over the place. And if you'll notice, the time is there almost is no time in Mark's gospel. There's only huge landmarks like John the Baptizer's, his preaching ministry, baptism, Herod Antipas, Herod the Great, the Herod kills John the Baptizer. We have a couple key moments, kind of, but time doesn't really start until what we call the Passion narrative. It's not until he gets arrested. Then all of a sudden, it's by the hour. The 3rd hour, the 6th hour, the 9th hour, the whatever. Most scholars think the Passion narrative is the most primitive material that carried around in the early church. That if I'm introducing Chelsea to Jesus, and who's Jesus? I'll say, let me tell you how it happened. He was a great man, powerful indeed in power. And on the night in which he was betrayed, he and his disciples had a last meal together, and and then 2 hours. And then it's time to like molasses. And it's amazing how detailed. And Mark and Matthew and Luke do the same thing. And John's also slower. But anything before then is loosey-goosey. And again, I would suggest that makes a lot of sense if Papias is telling the truth, because I bet Mark has just taken stories Peter's told him over time, mixed with some other stories he's told, like Barnabas, and he just puts the stories down. But he didn't care about chronology because he didn't receive it chronologically. So many things he says, like the parable of the seeds and all this stuff, we don't know the historical situation of that. We have no idea what was going on, and it was a sunny day. And then the Pharisee walked up and said, hey, what about them? We don't know the historical context. They're just story, story, story. Then he goes to the other side of the lake, and then he met a demon possessed, and he did this. And so little telltale sounds like that. But we don't know for sure. We don't. But that may be one. Matthew, Luke, and John are different, but if you want, I'll come back later on to save time. Bottom of page 37. Did you know today go to the bookstore and you can grab a book and say it's a novel. A novel by definition is fiction, right? By definition. You would never call it, that's not a biography. By definition, the genre of biography is a kind of history. How accurate it is, how they lay out the information, that depends on the author. But by definition, biography is historical, novel is fiction. Historical novel is by definition fiction, but it uses historical elements. So it will have historical markers. In the time of Hitler, movies do it all the time. It's a fantasy world of what might have happened if they were in the war or something. But it's not based on actual letters of an army soldier or something. It's an historical-based film. It's a historical novel, does the same thing. Well, in the ancient world, they had the same thing. They had all the same things. They did. They had biographies. They had novels. They had historical novels. And so the issue is, what are the Gospels? For a long time, scholars were sure that this is a kind of it can't be an ancient biography because X, Y, Z. But typically they said it can't be because it's not like today's biographies. Well, that's just silly. So then what happened in the last, 50 years or 100 years, people, quite frankly, really, Elaine, you'll appreciate this. It was my professor, Charles Talbert, who changed the tide.
Really?
Yeah, there was a guy named Rudolf Bultmann who was a towering figure of New Testament studies. And he argued over and over it can't be a gospel. And then my former professor in New Testament at Baylor, he wrote a thing in 1977, and it's a thin book, and it said, what is a gospel? And he argued by reading the ancient sources that Bultmann was wrong, and it changed the tide of New Testament scholarship. Then a guy named Richard Burge wrote a book called What Are the Gospels, which is a throwback to Talbert's book, What is a Gospel? And it's now the standard work. And because of his work, Burge's work, Richard Burge, it's changed New Testament scholarship. Now everybody thinks the Gospels are ancient biography. Everybody does. It's not an ancient novel because novels by definition were a fiction, and most novels in the ancient world, Greek, Roman, and Jewish, were romances. They had romance, almost all of them were. It's probably not a historical novel. They had those in the ancient world. They're very, very rare in the ancient world. And two, one of the problems of that theory is the Gospels have an enormous amount of historical markers. It's not like 2 or 3, 4 thrown in. It is packed full of them. So the part that must be fiction must be very, very small percentage of what actually is in the text. That's just not very likely. It's not a novel because we know that it's not a romance, ain't nothing lovely. Jesus doesn't get married, not a love story. Two, it's almost certainly not a historical novel. And it's not a modern biography because it doesn't tell us about like Winston Churchill's dog and what he ate for breakfast and how many times he cussed or drank. But instead, it's an ancient form of biography. In ancient biographies, there's different ways to understand biographies in the ancient world. There's a spectrum, you might say, but they understood biographies to be a kind of history, just like we do today. And the more close it was to the person they were describing, the more they went to living witnesses. And there's a guy named Polybius. He was a Roman historian. He wrote about the same time as the Gospels, 1st century. And he says, the best biographies are those when you go to the living witnesses, the living eyewitness testimony. So it's standard practice in the ancient world. If they're still alive or they were recently alive, you want to go to the living testimony. Your favorite friend now, Papias, that guy before with John Mark, all that stuff, he says the same thing. He says, we have written, but you want to go to he calls them the living witness, the living testimony. He means a person. Go talk. That's the best source of information. So the Gospels we have now are a form of ancient bios. We get the word, bios or biography. Mark and Matthew. Luke is a little more ancient historiography. That's a long story. But biographies don't care about chronological order. They're not concerned about tons of random details. An ancient biography was chiefly focused on the historical figure. The historical figure. Authors only chose specific stories of the main protagonist that demonstrated his character. I want that to sink in. If I wrote an ancient biography form of Chelsea, just to keep picking on her, I wouldn't talk, modern day I'd say she was born in a small village in Kansas or whatever. And born at this time, these parents, growing up, she loved dogs. I would tell as many details typically. The more thorough, the more we go, that's a good biography. I got to feel like I just met her. Ancient biographers didn't do that. Instead, I would try to write a story that conveyed what I thought was your character, your inside, what you really valued. So I would deliberately tell stories that point to that explicate your character. If I really want to emphasize how Chelsea's so generous, I'm going to tell a bunch of stories of you giving things. I'm going to tell stories. If I want to demonstrate that Chelsea is just difficult to understand, I'm going to tell a lot of stories about people that don't understand what you're saying. I want to say how funny she is. I'm going to tell stories of funny anecdotes. I'm not going to care much about your dog's name, what your hair looks. I mean, they don't care. They're trying to emphasize a character trait or traits. The Gospels do that too. There's one main character, and Burge looked at it, and he counted the words and verbs and everything, and it was very technical. But it's about one chief character, and they're trying to emphasize Jesus, who he is. That's very important, who he is and what he's done. And that's it. That's really it. We have these telltale signs like he ate fish. Well, that's good. I mean, any Galilean would eat fish, but what did he look like? When did he wake up in the morning? Besides prayer, sometimes we don't know. We don't have a clue. We don't know. I mean, we don't. It's tons of things. What was his favorite hobbies? Did he sing songs? Did he play guitar? Drums? We don't know. He sang a cappella. I was a softball. I was a softball. You know he sang a cappella. So that's what they're for. And let me pause here. Richard Burge really helped me see this. I went to the Society of Biblical Literature and I met him. He's British and fast talking, and funny, real witty. And his book is so good. But he really helped change the way I read the Gospels, because in ancient biography, I now ask the question about any story, like with the Old Testament. Now I say, what does it teach you about Jesus? Instead of focusing on, look at the faith of Peter to jump on that water. Could you do that too? Instead, focusing on Jesus and knowing who he is will make you do things you wouldn't do before. Knowing who he is will give you courage. Knowing who he is will make you do things you wouldn't do before. The healing the paralytic or whatever it is. In other words, you don't focus on the minor character. You focus on the major character, who's always Jesus. Those disciples sure are stupid. They don't understand junk. What a bunch of dim-witted fools. That's not the point. The point is, Jesus is the kind of character who's not always easy to understand. Sometimes he seems like he's otherworldly, and it's difficult for people to grasp. Who is this guy who commands the wind and the waves? Who does that? Well, they don't get anything. Of course they don't. The point is, Jesus can be the character who's difficult to grasp. It's always about him. And so the effect he has on people is important, but it tells us more about his character, if that makes sense. And they're written to persuade the audience. In John 20:31, he says that specifically. I wrote this so that you might believe. Most scholars think that all the Gospels probably shared this similar idea. There's some degree of persuasion, but maybe even more than that, or simultaneous, is discipleship. They want to grow disciples. That is, this isn't just evangelistic material, like I want to convert this brand new couple in my home and I'm going to give them a gospel. That could have happened, but it's more likely that it was used for the church to grow up in the faith. So discipleship probably seems to be the number one reason, outside of maybe John's gospel. So there's my question. What does this narrative tell me about the character of Jesus? Very, very important. You ask that question, you'll never be wrong. I'm telling you, you won't. You'll always ask that. What does it tell me about him? Here's a tip. Similar to how we interpret the Old Testament narratives, like I said, our focus in the gospel should not be on peripheral characters. No matter how you interpret the gospel text, keep the point about Jesus. I'm not suggesting you can never say anything about the side characters, but just in general, if your big therefore takeaway is, I need to be a lot more like Thomas. Nope, I think you missed the point. I want to be a lot like Mary. Well, okay, good, but you missed the point. You just that kind of stuff. A little footnote, because it's coming up, and I'm preparing the sermon series now on the birth of Jesus. The Gospels say, and I'll say this later on, that they say almost nothing about the birth of Jesus. They're called the birth narratives, but that's a misnomer. We don't know how he was born. We don't know where he was born exactly. We don't know exactly when he was born. The gospel narratives are not about his birth. They're about the characters surrounding his birth. And so what kind of person or being does this? What kind of person attracts these kind of people? Why do shepherds come? Why do angels declare glory? Why do Magi, or Magi if you're from Texas, why do they come from afar? I'm just teasing on Texan people or Southern people. So that's the question. It's all about Jesus and not about other peeps. Can I move ahead? Anything else? You stand up, take a break? Historical context in general, that is when you read a gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, the good news about that is you're talking about the exact same time period. That's good news for us. If you read 1 Kings or 2 Kings, you've changed hundreds of years. If you do Jeremiah versus Malachi, you've changed hundreds of years. Well, and read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's all in the first century. So once you learn about who a Pharisee is, who a scribe is, where the temple is, you're doing great. You're sailing. No matter what gospel you flip through, it's the same temple, same Pharisees, same whatever. They can describe them differently, but it's the same time period. And that's good. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is focused around Galilee, but in John, he's focused around Judea. And maybe I'll tell you later why I think that is. So in general, the first century was a conglomeration of multiple cultures and language, depending on which town you're in. If you're a hardcore like Jerusalem and some of these small villages, almost all Jews live there. But they were spread throughout Palestine, Greek-speaking people were. But they were predominantly influenced by Greek education and language, and Roman religion and military presence. Greeks influenced culture, Romans influenced the military and religion, you might say, more. Remember that everyone in Palestine was under Roman rule. Everybody was. You need to understand, everybody is. Their boss was Rome. They were not free. There's no democratic government. There's no Republican government. You don't vote. Why don't they just petition the government and stop all that slavery? They're not going to stop the slavery. There's a monarch, and they'll kill you. It's like petitioning Hitler. Hey, can you let go of the Jews? I mean, they're nice people. They kill you on the spot. They shoot you. They don't have to listen to you. So the ancient world, everybody in Palestine is under Roman rule. And if you work for the Romans and collected their taxes, guess how well liked you were? Right? That's just what happened to the Jews when the Jews became military police for the Nazis. I mean, they were hated. Well, that's what tax collectors happened to them. Finally, in general, you should assume that a first century person's worldview and values will very often be different from our own. This is why understanding historical context is crucial. Just don't assume we think like they do. It's hard to understand, but for me sometimes, but it's just true. Not always, but man, forget first century. Right now, if I go to Mexico, if I go to Asia, if I go to China, whatever, they just have different cultural values. They just do. I just learned something the other day about Chinese. I can't remember what it was. I never heard it my entire life. And I go, oh, I didn't know that about them. Oh, yeah, it's very important if you do this. So there we go. What about historical context specific to Jesus? Don't ever forget that he was born and died a first century Jew from Palestine. He spoke Aramaic, probably with some fluency in Greek and maybe Latin, had a mother and siblings. Joseph probably died before Jesus was an adult. He knew the Old Testament very well, attended sacrifices at the temple every year, celebrated Jewish holy days with every other Jew. He ate according to the Jewish dietary restrictions, kashrut. He didn't eat pork, never ate bacon, and attended synagogue each Saturday, probably, where he participated in learning scripture and public worship. He probably wore a head thing on his head. He probably wore those sash around that had the tassel on the bottom. He would have looked very Jewish. If you see him today on CNN, he would look like a Jew. He would not at all look like any of us in this room. And that's why I put on the right side, it is imperative we do not conceive Jesus as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed man who valued the American dream. Because everybody in America sure does. Jesus surely would agree with Republicans. He would surely agree with Democrats. I just listened to a podcast yesterday, a debate, and both sides were arguing vigorously that Jesus surely would agree to both sides of the debate, Democrat and Republican. It was on a Christian podcast. Clearly he'd been a Democrat, clearly been a Republican. They were giving verses, and they were good points. But the point is, that wasn't the point they were making about the American dream, but we do like to think he's very American. And everyone has. Ever since the Old West, he'd have been a cowboy. He would have celebrated manifest destiny. And he would have celebrated the oil. He would have celebrated, on and on it goes. And that's nonsense. A little footnote's kind of funny. On my Twitter, I hired a person a long time ago, a social media marketer, for a little bit of money. And he has these programs where he promotes my blogs and stuff. And I don't pay him anymore, of course not, but he never turned it off. So now around the clock, my Twitter is always doing these feeds. Which is great, because then people can see I posted something. But the people who made the little Twitter comments of, click out this blah, blah, they'll put a picture with it. And I almost always have comments on people and say, he's not some blonde hair, blah, blah. Well, I didn't choose the Jesus picture, but it'll have some picture where he looks white. Now, it's not this. I chose the gaudy, awful one here. I know here's in print color, but it's not that bad. But, boy, they don't like it. Or some people say, he was black. And like, oh, that stuff. He wasn't black. He wasn't black. Yeah, olive skin. I mean, yeah.
I know something from the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, he would have fit in perfectly. He was not black.
That at Christmas time when you have your nativity set. Don't
Yeah.
be a little white baby Jesus.
Yeah. We were at Orlando. I was at Orlando, and I was at the Holy Land experience, and which was really interesting. But they had this final finale. My favorite part was example of scriptorium, and they had ancient manuscripts. Some, mostly were translations of the Bible, but some were first editions of really important ones. And that was really cool. At the very, very end, you stand in this round room, and there's a loud voice, and it'll say, "My name is Moses, and I'm doing this." Curtain comes up, and it has this painting with a spotlight on him, and he's got this pose, or he's writing the Ten Commandments or something. "My name is Joseph," and the thing comes up. He goes on the list, and then the music goes, "Ah!" And every guy was just as flat out white as you could be. All of them were they were all 50, 60-year-old white men. Some look a little bit, beards, but and I bet hardly anybody who goes there ever will go, "I don't like that they're white." What? They'll go, "Oh, that's right, it's good stuff. Joseph, Ruth, everyone's white. I love it." None of those people would have been white. None of them Caucasian. None of them been Caucasian. I mean, they really wouldn't have been.
And
So
then they often have a British accent in movies.
they're British. That's right. All the Jews are Brits. It does, doesn't it? Sounds authoritative. Blessed are. Yeah. So I'm trying to help you. When you read Jesus, it helps sometimes for me. Do what you want. But a lot of times I try to picture him. As Jewish as a picture, and that's just awful. It's not. I want to picture him and realize when he's talking, it's not like me. He's not. And so that helps me think, wait a second, do I know what he meant back then about that word and that concept? Because that's different. A tip, in the Gospels, nearly everything makes better sense if you understand how something was understood of the original audience. So it is always appropriate to ask the question, what did this word or phrase or concept mean in the ancient world? Look up everything you can in a good commentary, dictionary, study Bible. But go to Mark chapter 2:16. This is a great example of Mark 2:16. And while you're turning, please, I encourage you again, if I can, please don't ever be ashamed. Have the pride to go, "I don't need all that stuff." Just, man, look it up. Look it up, or ask someone. Please, I do it all the time. Mark 2:16, he's talking about not eating with tax collectors. In 2:16, he says, when the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Well, who gives a rip? Look in verse 18. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples don't fast?" Well, who gives a rip? Go on to verse 24. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Well, who cares? What is he talking about? They were plucking the heads of grain in verse 23. Well, if I'm encouraging you, don't skip over those things. I don't know what that means, but I'll just keep going. Look up a good Bible comment, a good dictionary. A good study Bible will tell you why that's important to them. It's really important. Any questions about that? Comments? I'm plugging along.